Detective Marcus Reed had seen many strange things during his 15 years with the Chicago Police Department, but nothing could have prepared him for the morning of October 17th. The city had always been alive with sound, a constant symphony of car horns, distant sirens, and the chatter of millions of voices blending into white noise. But that morning, as Marcus drove through the empty streets toward the downtown precinct, an unnatural silence had settled over everything like a heavy blanket. His radio crackled with static, cutting in and out with fragments of panicked voices that made no sense. Something about people not waking up. Something about hospitals being overwhelmed. Something about staying indoors. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, as an inexplicable dread settled into his bones. The precinct was chaos when he arrived. Officers rushed past him without acknowledgement, their faces pale and drawn. Captain Patricia Hoffman stood in the center of the bullpen, barking orders into a phone that apparently wasn't working, her normally composed demeanor cracked and fraying at the edges. She slammed the receiver down when she spotted Marcus, her steel-gray eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made him pause mid-step. "Reed, thank God. We need everyone we can get," she said, her voice hoarse as if she'd been shouting for hours. She thrust a printed report into his hands, the paper still warm from the printer. 17 hospitals across the city reported the same thing at approximately 4:30 this morning. Patients who were declared dead between midnight and 4 a.m. started showing signs of movement. Not life, Reed. Movement. Marcus scanned the report, his trained eye catching the key details even as his mind struggled to process them. Morgues with empty drawers. Bodies missing from emergency rooms. Security footage showing the deceased sitting up on gurneys and walking out of hospitals with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "This has to be some kind of hoax," he muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. Patricia shook her head, her jaw set in a grim line. "I wish it were. We've got confirmed sightings across the north side. Officer Daniels radioed in 20 minutes ago from Lincoln Park. He said people were attacking civilians. Biting them, Marcus. He said they moved like they were broken, but they didn't stop even when he fired warning shots." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus looked up from the report, searching Patricia's face for any sign that this was some elaborate test or drill, but found only raw fear barely contained beneath her professional exterior. "Where's Daniels now?" he asked quietly. Patricia's silence was answer enough. She turned away, reaching for another stack of reports, but not before Marcus saw her hand tremble. "We're establishing a command center here. The mayor's office has gone dark. We can't reach the governor. The National Guard isn't responding. Right now we're on our own." Marcus moved to the window overlooking the street below. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the abandoned vehicles and empty sidewalks. Then he saw them. 3 figures emerged from an alley across the street, their movements unnaturally stiff and disjointed, like marionettes controlled by an amateur puppeteer. They wore regular clothes, a business suit, hospital scrubs, and a delivery uniform, but something was fundamentally wrong with the way they carried themselves. Their heads tilted at odd angles, and even from this distance, Marcus could see dark stains covering their clothing. A woman jogging with her dog rounded the corner, earbuds in, completely oblivious to the danger. Marcus's heart lurched. He pounded on the window, shouting, but she couldn't hear him. The 3 figures turned in unison toward the jogger, their movements suddenly purposeful despite their broken gait. What happened next would be seared into Marcus's memory forever. The figures moved faster than he thought possible, covering the distance in seconds. The woman's scream was cut short and Marcus turned away, his stomach churning. Behind him, Patricia was already moving, her service weapon drawn. "This is it, Reed. This is where we make our stand. Get armed, get ready, and find anyone who's still alive out there. We're going to need every survivor we can find if we're going to make it through whatever this is." As Marcus checked his weapon and prepared to head back into the silent streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world he knew had ended sometime during the night, and none of them had even noticed until it was too late. Marcus stepped out of the precinct alongside Officer Jennifer Wade and rookie cop Tyler Bennett, their boots echoing against the pavement in the oppressive silence. Jennifer had been with the force for 8 years, a sharp-minded officer who rarely showed fear, but Marcus noticed the way her hand kept drifting to her holster every few seconds. Tyler, fresh out of the academy just 6 months ago, Looked like he might be sick at any moment, his face a shade of green that had nothing to do with his uniform. They had a simple mission. Reach the community center 4 blocks north where emergency services had received a garbled call about survivors barricading themselves inside. 4 blocks had never seemed so far. The trio moved in a tight formation, their eyes scanning every doorway, every alley, every shadow that might conceal one of those things. Marcus refused to call them what his mind kept suggesting. Zombies belonged in movies and comic books, not in the streets of Chicago on a Tuesday morning. Yet the evidence was impossible to deny. Bodies lay scattered along the sidewalks, some still, others twitching with that horrible jerky movement that suggested something was trying to remember how to make them work. The smell hit them at the second block, a combination of copper and decay that made Tyler finally lose his breakfast against a storefront window. "Keep it together, Bennett," Jennifer whispered sharply, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "We need you focused." They pressed forward, and that's when they heard it, a child crying. The sound came from above, and Marcus traced it to a second-floor window of an apartment building. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, pressed her face against the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks. Behind her, Marcus could see movement, dark shapes lurching through the apartment. "We have to get her," Tyler said, already moving toward the building's entrance, but Marcus grabbed his arm. "Wait. We assess first. We can't help her if we get ourselves killed." But the decision was made for them when the apartment door behind the little girl burst open, and one of those things stumbled into view. The girl's screams intensified, and Marcus was already running, taking the building stairs 3 at a time with Jennifer and Tyler close behind. The apartment door was locked, and Marcus didn't hesitate, throwing his shoulder against it once, twice, until the frame splintered. The creature turned toward them, and Marcus got his first clear look at one of the infected up close. It had been a man once, probably in his 40s, wearing the remnants of pajamas now soaked with dark blood. His eyes were clouded over, milky white with no recognition or humanity behind them. His jaw hung at an unnatural angle, broken or dislocated, and a low moan emanated from his throat, a sound that raised every hair on Marcus's neck. The thing lunged and Marcus fired. The shot hit center mass just as he'd been trained, but the creature barely staggered. It kept coming. "The head!" Jennifer shouted, her own weapon raised. "Aim for the head." Her shot was true, and the creature dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. The silence that followed was deafening. The little girl, whose name they learned was Emma Thompson, clung to Marcus as they made their way back down the stairs. She hadn't spoken since they'd found her, just held onto his neck with a grip that threatened to choke him. Her parents had been visiting her grandmother, she'd finally whispered. They hadn't come home. The grandmother had died in her sleep, and then she hadn't stayed dead. Emma had locked herself in her room and waited. Marcus felt a burning anger in his chest, not at the child, but at the incomprehensible situation that had put her through such horror. They emerged from the building to find the street was no longer empty. At least a dozen of the infected had appeared, drawn perhaps by the gunshots, shuffling toward them with that characteristic broken gait. "Run," Marcus said quietly. Then louder, "Run." They sprinted toward the community center, Emma bouncing against Marcus's shoulder, Jennifer and Tyler providing cover, their shots echoing off the buildings. Each report seemed to draw more of the creatures from the shadows, and Marcus realized with growing horror that the city might be full of them, thousands or maybe tens of thousands, all waiting in the darkness of buildings and homes. The community center appeared ahead, its doors barricaded with furniture visible through the glass. Marcus pounded on the entrance, shouting for them to open up, acutely aware of the moaning horde closing in behind them. The door cracked open, hands reached out, and they were pulled inside just as the first of the infected reached the entrance. As Marcus collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath with Emma still clutching his jacket, he looked around at the frightened faces of the 24 survivors huddled in the center. This was humanity now, he thought. Small pockets of terrified people hiding from a world that had turned against them overnight and no one knew why. The community center had become a makeshift fortress, its windows covered with tables, chairs, and whatever else the survivors had managed to pile against them. Marcus set Emma down gently, and she was immediately swept up by a middle-aged woman named Claire Morrison, a former teacher who had taken it upon herself to care for the 3 other children huddled in the corner. Marcus counted heads while Jennifer and Tyler helped reinforce the barricades. 26 survivors in total, ranging from elderly Mrs. Dorothy Klein, who sat in a wheelchair near the back wall, to a teenager named Jake Patterson who couldn't have been more than 16. They all had the same look in their eyes: shock, fear, and the desperate hope that someone in uniform would have answers. Marcus hated to disappoint them, but he had nothing but questions himself. A broad-shouldered man in his 30s approached, his flannel shirt stained with blood that Marcus hoped wasn't his own. "Name's Robert Hayes," he said, extending a hand that Marcus shook firmly. "I'm the one who made the call to emergency services. That was about 2 hours ago. You're the first responders we've seen." His voice carried an edge of accusation that Marcus couldn't really blame him for. "The situation is worse than anyone realized," Marcus replied honestly. "The entire city might be affected. We're operating on our own right now. What happened here? How did you all end up together?" Robert's jaw clenched as he glanced back at the survivors. "I run a construction company. Was doing a job 3 blocks from here when people started acting crazy, attacking each other. I grabbed my crew and ran. Found the center open. Mrs. Klein was running her morning senior exercise class. People started showing up, running from those things out there." He paused, his voice dropping. "We had 31 people an hour ago." Marcus didn't ask what happened to the other 5. The scratches on Robert's knuckles and the freshly moved filing cabinet blocking what looked like a supply closet told that story well enough. A woman's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and accusatory. "You're cops. You're supposed to protect us. So what's the plan? When are the real teams coming?" The speaker was Amanda Price, a lawyer still clutching her briefcase like a lifeline, her expensive suit rumpled and torn at the shoulder. Jennifer stepped forward before Marcus could respond. "Ma'am, we are the real rescue team. And right now the plan is survival. The phone lines are down. Radio communication is sporadic at best. We don't know the extent of the outbreak or if help is coming." The word, outbreak, seemed to hit the group like a physical blow. Outbreak meant disease. Outbreak meant this could spread. Several people began talking at once, their voices rising in panic until Marcus raised his hand. "Listen to me. All of you. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But panic will get us killed faster than those things out there. We need to stay calm, stay quiet, and stay together." An older man named Vincent Torres, who had identified himself as a retired Marine, stood from where he'd been checking the back exit. "The detective's right. Discipline keeps you alive. What's our supply situation?" Claire spoke up from the corner. "We have the vending machines. Someone broke them open already. Maybe enough food and water for 2 days if we ration carefully. There's a small kitchen, but the refrigerator only has leftovers from yesterday's senior lunch program." 2 days. Marcus exchanged glances with Jennifer. 2 days wasn't enough time for this to blow over. Whatever was happening, whatever had caused the dead to rise and attack the living, it wasn't going to resolve itself in 48 hours. They needed a better plan. Tyler, who had been quiet since their harrowing escape, suddenly called out from the window. "Detective Reed, you need to see this." Marcus made his way over, careful not to disturb the barricade. Tyler pointed toward the street, and Marcus felt his blood run cold. The infected weren't wandering aimlessly anymore. They were gathering, at least 50 of them now, standing in an almost organized cluster in front of the community center. They swayed slightly, that low moaning sound building like a horrible chorus, but they weren't attacking the building. They were waiting. "That's not possible," Jennifer whispered beside him. "They're supposed to be mindless. Just bodies running on instinct." But the scene before them suggested otherwise. The infected stood there, their clouded eyes fixed on the building, and Marcus could have sworn that some of them were watching the windows with something that looked disturbingly like patience. Behind them, Amanda's voice rose again. "What's happening? What do you see?" Marcus turned back to face the crowd of survivors, aware that his next words would either give them hope or send them into despair. "We're going to need to fortify this place better," he said carefully. "And we're going to need to do it quietly. I think they're learning." The community center suddenly felt much smaller, the walls thinner, and the 26 survivors seemed far too few against what was gathering outside in the silent streets of a dead Chicago morning. The next few hours passed in tense preparation as Marcus organized the survivors into teams. Vincent Torres took charge of fortifications, his military experience proving invaluable as he directed Robert and his construction crew to reinforce weak points in their defenses. Jennifer worked with Claire to inventory their supplies, her face growing grimmer with each count. Tyler was assigned to watch rotation, though Marcus noticed the young officer's hands still trembled slightly whenever he gripped his weapon. The infected outside remained in their unsettling vigil, their numbers growing steadily as more emerged from buildings and alleyways, drawn by something the survivors couldn't identify. Marcus found himself studying them through a small gap in the barricade, trying to understand what he was seeing. They moved with more coordination now than they had in the morning, and while their individual movements remained jerky and unnatural, as a group they seemed to pulse with an almost collective awareness. Jake, the teenager, appeared at Marcus's shoulder, his young face trying hard to appear brave. "My dad's out there somewhere," he said quietly. "He was on a business trip to New York. Think he's okay?" Marcus wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but he'd never been good at sugarcoating reality. "I think if your dad is half as tough as you're being right now, he's fighting to get back to you." It wasn't really an answer, but Jake seemed to accept it, nodding slowly before returning to help Claire with the children. Amanda approached Marcus with Robert beside her, their earlier antagonism apparently set aside in favor of survival. "We've been talking," Amanda said, her lawyer's mind clearly working through scenarios. "Even with rationing we have 2 days of supplies. But that's assuming we stay put. What if we made a run for it? Tried to reach the precinct or somewhere more secure?" Robert crossed his arms. "My truck's parked 2 blocks from here. It's a crew cab, could fit 8, maybe 10 people if we packed in tight. We could make multiple trips." Marcus considered it. The precinct had more supplies, better defenses, and Captain Hoffman would be coordinating whatever response was still functioning. But the streets between here and there were filled with the infected, and they'd barely made it 4 blocks with just 3 officers. Moving 26 people, including children and Mrs. Klein in her wheelchair, seemed like suicide. "It's too risky right now," Marcus said. "We don't know enough about how they hunt, how they track. Until we understand what we're dealing with, we stay put and stay quiet." Amanda looked like she wanted to argue, but a crash from the back of the building cut off whatever she was about to say. Everyone froze. The sound came again, metal scraping against concrete. Vincent was already moving, his weathered face set in hard lines as he gestured for Marcus and Jennifer to follow. They found the source at the loading dock entrance, a rolling metal door that they'd secured with a chain. Something was testing it from the outside, pushing against it with rhythmic thuds that suggested purpose rather than random wandering. "They're trying to find a way in," Vincent whispered. "That's coordinated behavior. Whatever these things are, they're not as mindless as we hoped." Tyler joined them, his weapon drawn. "Should we engage?" Marcus shook his head. "We don't know how many are out there. Gunfire will just draw more. We reinforce and stay silent." But even as he gave the order, Marcus heard Mrs. Klein's voice rise from the main room, confused and frightened. "Harold? Harold, is that you?" Marcus's heart sank as he rushed back to find the elderly woman at one of the windows, pulling at the barricade. Claire was trying to calm her, but Mrs. Klein was surprisingly strong in her desperation. "My husband. I heard his voice. He's calling for me." She managed to pull aside a chair, and her face pressed against the glass. Outside, one of the infected stood directly at the window, its mouth moving in that characteristic moan that could, to a desperate mind, sound like speech. The thing had probably been drawn by the noise inside, but Mrs. Klein was convinced it was her deceased husband. "Dorothy, no." Claire grabbed for her, but the elderly woman's hand found the window lock. Everything happened in slow motion. The window opened. The infected's arms reached through. Mrs. Klein screamed, a sound of terror rather than pain, as gray hands grasped at her. Robert was there in an instant, pulling her back as Marcus and Vincent slammed the window shut. The infected's arms were trapped, flailing with mechanical persistence. Vincent brought down a fire axe he'd found earlier, and the limbs fell away. The creature outside didn't even flinch, just pressed its face against the glass, leaving smears of dark fluid. Mrs. Klein collapsed in her wheelchair, sobbing. "I just wanted it to be Harold. I just wanted to not be alone." Claire held her, whispering comfort, but the damage was done. The infected outside had become agitated, the entire mass of them surging forward. The moaning grew louder, and the building began to shake as dozens of bodies pressed against the walls. "Positions," Marcus shouted. "Everyone away from the windows. This is it." The siege had begun, and as the sound of breaking glass echoed from the far end of the building, Marcus realized their 2 days of supplies had just become a very optimistic estimate. They'd be lucky to survive the next 2 hours. The infected poured through the broken window on the eastern side of the community center like water through a cracked dam. Vincent and Robert rushed to meet them, wielding a crowbar and a length of pipe respectively, their faces masks of determination and controlled terror. Marcus fired 3 precise shots, each one dropping an infected, but for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to claw their way through the opening. Jennifer pulled the children toward the kitchen area, the most defensible space they had, while Tyler worked frantically to build a secondary barricade using whatever furniture remained. The survivors who could fight formed a desperate line, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary horror, wielding makeshift weapons against an enemy that felt no pain and showed no fear. Amanda swung a fire extinguisher with surprising ferocity, the metal connecting with skull and bone. Jake fought beside her with a baseball bat he'd found in the storage closet, the teenager's face streaked with tears but his stance unwavering. Claire had armed herself with a kitchen knife, positioned protectively in front of Emma and the other children, ready to make a last stand if the line broke. The noise was overwhelming, gunshots, screams, the horrible wet sounds of impact, and beneath it all, that relentless moaning that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's chest. "We can't hold them," Robert shouted, backing up as 3 infected pushed through together, their combined weight too much for him to stop alone. Marcus moved to help, but his weapon clicked empty. No time to reload. He drew his backup piece and continued firing, but he could see the terrible mathematics of their situation. They had limited ammunition facing an enemy that seemed limitless. Then Vincent did something that would change everything. The old Marine grabbed a rolling cart loaded with supplies and shoved it toward the broken window with all his strength. "The opening," he yelled. "Block the opening, not the creatures." Understanding flashed through Marcus's mind. They'd been fighting the infected individually when they should have been preventing entry entirely. He joined Vincent, and together with Robert, they began pushing heavy objects toward the breach, not trying to fight the infected but to seal the gap they were using. A filing cabinet. A heavy wooden desk. A metal shelving unit. The infected clawed at them, grabbed at their clothes, their skin, but the 3 men pushed forward with desperate strength. Tyler saw what they were doing and abandoned his secondary barricade to help, adding his weight to theirs. Inch by inch they closed the gap. Marcus felt hands grab his jacket, felt the hot breath of something that should have been dead on his neck, but he didn't stop pushing. With a final heave, the desk slammed into place and Robert wedged the shelving unit against it at an angle, creating a barrier the infected couldn't easily move or climb. The ones that had made it inside were quickly dealt with by the survivors, their numbers manageable now that the flood had been stopped. As the last infected inside fell to Vincent's crowbar, a horrible silence settled over the community center, broken only by the heavy breathing of exhausted survivors and the muffled moaning from outside. Marcus did a quick head count, his heart sinking. 23. They'd lost 3 people in the assault. 2 of Robert's crew members and a young woman named Kelly Martinez who had been standing too close to the window when it broke. Her body lay still now, and Marcus knew they'd have to deal with it before she became something else. "Is anyone bitten?" Jennifer called out, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "If you're injured, we need to know now." The survivors looked at each other, checking themselves and their neighbors. Then Jake slowly raised his hand, his face pale. I think one of them got me." He pulled up his sleeve to reveal a nasty gash on his forearm, the skin around it already looking inflamed and wrong. Claire gasped, and several survivors backed away instinctively. The teenager stood alone in the center of the room, looking suddenly very young and very frightened. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It happened so fast. I didn't even feel it at first." Marcus approached slowly, examining the wound. It was definitely a bite, the distinctive pattern of human teeth clear in the torn flesh. He'd seen enough in the past hours to know what this meant, even if he didn't want to accept it. "How long?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. "How long do I have?" Marcus realized the kid wasn't asking how long until he died. He was asking how long until he became one of those things. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. The teenager nodded, wiping his eyes with his good hand. "Then I want to make it count. However long I've got left, I want to help. I want to make sure the rest of you get out of here." Amanda, who had fought beside him just moments ago, stepped forward despite the risk. "We're not giving up on you, kid. Maybe you're immune. Maybe it works differently for different people. Maybe I'm dead already," Jake interrupted, but not unkindly. "And maybe pretending otherwise gets someone else killed." The harsh truth of his words settled over the group like a weight. Outside, the infected continued their siege, their numbers seemingly endless. Inside, the survivors faced a new horror. One of their own was infected, and no one knew if he would turn in minutes, hours, or days. Marcus looked at the frightened faces around him and realized that surviving the infected might be the easy part. The real test would be holding on to their humanity while doing it. The group spent the next hour in tense debate while Jake sat apart from everyone, his bitten arm wrapped in cloth torn from his own shirt. Vincent wanted to isolate him immediately in the supply closet where they'd locked the others who had turned. Amanda argued for keeping him comfortable and monitored, insisting they needed to understand the infection if they had any hope of long-term survival. Claire simply wept quietly, having grown attached to the brave teenager over the past hours. Marcus found himself in the impossible position of making a decision that could mean life or death for everyone. He approached Jake, sitting down beside him despite Jennifer's warning look. The kid was sweating now, his face flushed with fever, but his eyes were still clear and aware. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Jake managed a weak smile. "Like I've got the worst flu of my life. Everything aches. I'm cold but I'm sweating. And I keep having these weird thoughts like static in my brain." He looked down at his wrapped arm. "It's spreading. I can feel it moving up toward my shoulder like ice in my veins." Marcus had to know. "The static in your brain. What kind of thoughts?" The teenager's expression became distant, troubled. "It's hard to explain. Like I can almost hear something, a lot of somethings, all humming on the same frequency. And I keep wanting to go to the window to be outside with them. It's not like a craving, more like a pull. Like magnetism." This was valuable information, horrifying as it was. The infected weren't just dead bodies reanimated randomly. There was something connecting them, some kind of shared consciousness or signal that Jake was beginning to tune into. "You're doing great, kid," Marcus said. "Every bit of information you can give us might help save lives." Jake nodded weakly, then his expression changed. "They're going to try the back again. So, they know it's weaker." Marcus stood quickly. "How do you know that?" But Jake's eyes had glazed over slightly, his head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. Marcus didn't wait to question further. He rushed to the loading dock where Vincent was already stationed. "We need to reinforce this area now. Jake says they're coming here next." Vincent didn't ask how Jake knew. He just started pulling over more furniture, and Robert joined him without hesitation. They'd barely finished adding another layer to their barricade when the assault began, just as Jake had predicted. The infected threw themselves against the loading dock door with renewed vigor, the metal groaning under the sustained impact. "This changes things," Jennifer said quietly to Marcus as they braced the door. "If Jake can sense their intentions even partially, he's our early warning system." Marcus knew she was right, but the implications were terrifying. To use Jake's connection to the infected meant letting the infection progress, and every minute that passed brought the teenager closer to becoming one of the things they were fighting against. The assault on the loading dock lasted 20 brutal minutes before the infected seemed to lose interest and return to their waiting vigil outside the main entrance. When Marcus returned to check on Jake, he found the teenager convulsing, his back arched and his wrapped arm twitching violently. Claire was trying to help him, but Amanda pulled her back. "Don't touch him. We don't know if it's contagious through contact with his sweat or saliva." Tyler knelt at a safe distance, his young face etched with sympathy for someone not much younger than himself. "Jake, can you hear me? What do you need?" Jake's convulsions subsided, and he lay gasping on the floor. When he spoke, his voice was strained and different, raspier than before. "Gun. Need you to, when I turn. Don't let me hurt anyone." Emma, the little girl they'd rescued, pulled away from Claire and approached despite the danger, her small voice cutting through the tension. "You're not going to turn. You're too strong. I can tell." Her childish faith seemed to give Jake strength. He managed to sit up, though Marcus could see the tremors running through his body. "Thanks, kiddo. But just in case, I want everyone to promise. The second I'm not me anymore, you end it?" No hesitation. Vincent stepped forward, his military bearing evident. "You have my word, son. But until that moment comes, you're one of us. You fight with us." The old Marine's words seemed to settle something in the room. Whatever Jake was becoming, he was still human right now, and they would treat him with the dignity he deserved. But Marcus couldn't shake the cold logic of their situation. They were trapped in a building surrounded by hundreds of infected, running low on supplies, with one of their own slowly transforming into the enemy. They needed a new plan, and they needed it before Jake's time ran out. As if reading his thoughts, Robert approached with a rolled-up paper he'd found in the community center's office. "I've been looking at the building schematics," he said, spreading the blueprint on a table. "There's a maintenance tunnel system that runs under this block. It was part of the old city infrastructure. If we can access it, we might have a way out that doesn't involve going through that horde." Marcus studied the plans, a dangerous hope building in his chest. It was risky, maybe suicidal, but it was something. "How do we access it?" Robert pointed to a spot on the blueprint. "Through the basement. But there's a problem. The entrance was sealed with concrete 20 years ago when they condemned the tunnel system. We'd have to break through, and that means noise. A lot of noise. Marcus looked around at the exhausted, frightened faces of the 23 survivors counting on him to keep them alive. Then he looked at Jake, who was fighting his own internal battle against an enemy none of them fully understood. Sometimes the only choice was between bad options and worse ones. Then we'd better make it count, Marcus said. Because we're only going to get one chance at this. The decision to attempt the tunnel escape was made in the early hours before dawn, when the infected outside seemed to enter a state of reduced activity, their movements slower and less coordinated in the darkness. Marcus organized the survivors into groups. Vincent and Robert would lead the breakthrough team in the basement, Jennifer and Tyler would maintain a defensive position upstairs to hold off any breach, and Claire would shepherd the children and Mrs. Klein, keeping them ready to move at a moment's notice. Jake, despite his worsening condition, insisted on helping. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes had begun to cloud at the edges, but his mind remained sharp, and his ability to sense the infected's movements had only grown stronger. "They're mostly at the front," he reported, his voice now permanently raspy. "But when you start breaking through that concrete, they'll know. They'll all know. I can feel how they react to sound, to vibration. It draws them like moths to flame." Marcus gripped the teenager's shoulder, feeling the unnatural coldness of his skin through the fabric. "Then we'll use that. We'll create a distraction upstairs, pull them away from the basement level. You bought us this chance, Jake. We're going to make it count." The basement was a dark, musty space filled with old equipment and boxes of forgotten supplies. Robert had assembled what tools they had: a sledgehammer, 2 crowbars, and a small pickaxe. The sealed tunnel entrance was exactly where the blueprints indicated, a concrete wall that looked frustratingly solid. "This is going to take time," Robert warned. "And it won't be quiet." Vincent hefted the sledgehammer. "Then let's not waste any more of either." The first blow rang out like a gunshot in the confined space. Upstairs, Marcus heard the immediate response. The moaning of the infected rose to a fever pitch, and the pressure against their barricades intensified. "Here they come," Tyler shouted from his position. Jennifer fired controlled shots through gaps in the barricade, trying to slow the surge without wasting ammunition. Amanda and several other survivors threw their weight against the furniture blocking the windows as the infected pushed harder. Emma hugged her knees in the corner, and Claire sang softly to her, a lullaby that seemed absurdly gentle against the soundtrack of chaos. In the basement, Robert and Vincent worked in alternating rhythm, the sledgehammer cracking concrete while the crowbars pried away chunks. Dust filled the air, and sweat poured down their faces despite the cold. Marcus monitored their progress while listening to the sounds from above, calculating how long their defenses could hold. Then Jake appeared at the basement stairs, moving with an unsteady gait. "Marcus, they're changing tactics. They're going to hit the loading dock and the front simultaneously. They're coordinating." Before Marcus could respond, the building shuddered with the impact of the infected's unified assault. The sound of splintering would echoed from above, and Jennifer's voice cut through the chaos. "We've got a breach. Multiple breaches. We can't hold them." Robert swung the sledgehammer with desperate strength, and suddenly it broke through, revealing darkness beyond. "We're in. The tunnel's open." Vincent widened the hole with savage efficiency, creating an opening large enough for people to squeeze through. Marcus ran to the stairs, shouting for everyone to evacuate to the basement. The survivors came flooding down, Claire carrying Emma while Tyler supported Mrs. Klein. Amanda and the others formed a retreating defense, backing down the stairs as infected hands reached through the broken barricades above. Jake stood at the top of the basement stairs, and Marcus realized with horror what the teenager intended. "Jake, no. Come on." But Jake shook his head, his clouded eyes meeting Marcus's one last time with unmistakable clarity. "I can feel it, Marcus. I'm almost gone. But I can still do this. I can draw them. Keep them focused on me while you run." Before anyone could stop him, Jake stumbled back into the main room, shouting and banging on the walls. The infected turned toward him en masse, their attention fixed on the noise and movement. Tyler tried to go back for him, but Marcus held the young officer back. He made his choice. Honor it by surviving. They pushed through the tunnel entrance one by one, Vincent leading with a flashlight from someone's keychain. The tunnel was narrow, claustrophobic, and ancient, but it led away from the community center, away from the horde. Marcus went last, pausing only to look back at the basement stairs. He could hear Jake's voice, still human, still fighting, and then it was drowned out by the moaning of the infected and the sounds of feeding. Marcus pulled himself through the opening and Robert sealed it behind them with rubble, muffling the sounds from above. The 22 survivors moved through the darkness, following the tunnel that Robert believed led toward the old industrial district. No one spoke. They were too exhausted, too traumatized, too aware of who they'd lost. But they were alive, and in this new silent era, that was its own kind of victory. After what felt like hours, they emerged through a rusted grate into the gray light of dawn. The city stretched before them, silent and unknown, filled with dangers they couldn't yet imagine. Marcus looked at the faces of the survivors, these ordinary people who had become extraordinary through necessity. Jennifer, Tyler, Vincent, Robert, Amanda, Claire, Emma, Mrs. Klein, and the others. They were battered, grieving, and terrified, but they were together. "This isn't over," Vincent said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking. Marcus checked his weapon, counted his remaining ammunition, and looked toward the distant skyline where smoke rose from a dozen fires. "No," he agreed. "It's just beginning. But we know more now than we did yesterday. We know they can coordinate. We know the infection spreads through bites. We know that sound draws them. And we know that people like Jake are willing to sacrifice everything to give the rest of us a chance." He turned to face the group fully. "We find other survivors. We find safe shelter. We learn everything we can about these things. And we survive. That's how we honor everyone we've lost. That's how we take back our world." Emma slipped her small hand into his and Claire stood straighter. Tyler and Jennifer checked their weapons with renewed purpose. Even Mrs. Klein sat up in her wheelchair with something like determination in her eyes. They were humanity's remnants, walking into an uncertain future in a world transformed overnight. But they were walking forward, and sometimes that was enough. The silent era had begun, but humanity's struggle was far from over. In fact, Marcus thought as they moved into the empty streets, it had only just begun. And this time they would be ready. The end.